Well, friends, we have a very rich program. During the course of that, the next couple of hours, we'll be able to share with you a little of what SHAPE has in mind in the coming months and beyond. Let me just say for now that when Richard Falk, Chandra Muzaffar and I got together, I think it was about a year ago, we knew that humanity was on a rather slippery and dangerous slope. We were all three deeply concerned by the war in Ukraine and, importantly, by the powerful currents that had led to it. We saw clearly that those currents were equally evident in another theater, the Asia-Pacific region, which is the focus of today's webinar. Some 20 minutes later, we are in the process of gradually constructing a program that we hope is ambitious and in line with our holistic understanding and approach to the world as it is now. We have a very interesting program, I think, outstanding speakers who are making a very important contribution to the public debate. After we've heard from them, we'll have quite a fair bit of time for Q&A. But it's very important that if you have a question, anyone has a question, please make sure it goes into the Q&A box, not in the chat box. I will be closely looking at the Q&A box as we go through, but I will not be looking at the chat box. So please, any questions, succinct and to the point, preferably with a question mark at the end, please put them in the Q&A box in the course of the next hour or so. Well, I must begin by first introducing you to Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, one of the three co-founders of SHAPE, who will make just a few introductory remarks. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is one of Asia's leading public intellectuals. He has played a very active role in universities and in the public arena, of course in his own country, but well beyond. He's written many books, and it's a pleasure to introduce him as a colleague and a friend. Chandra, over to you.
Thank you, Jill. Sisters and brothers, peace be with you. This is the fourth webinar organized by SHAPE. Like the three webinars before this webinar is also concerned with peace and security and the threat of war. This time, our focus is on the Asia-Pacific region, largely because very recently, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States decided to create a security pact called AUKUS, AUKUS, linked to the names of the three countries. They decided to create the security pact for the Asia-Pacific region. And this is what we are going to look at in our panel discussion in a while. What is the purpose of AUKUS? Those of us who are part of SHAPE know what the purpose is. It is to contain China. To contain China through the perpetuation, the enhancement of the power of the US in this region. We feel that AUKUS, as it is constructed, is a threat to peace in this region. We feel that it could lead to tensions and friction and may even lay the conditions for a major war in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's the reason why we want people in the Asia-Pacific region and elsewhere to be alert, to know what is happening. We want them to raise their voices. And we want others in other parts of the world to raise their voices against AUKUS, against this Asia-Pacific NATO that is in the offing. And our panel discussion is part of that endeavor. Before we move on to the panel, I would like to draw attention to an individual who was part of so many campaigns in the past, who made a huge contribution to developing global awareness, mind you, about nuclear weapons and the danger of war. I'm referring to our dear friend, departed friend, Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg was supposed to participate in the third webinar, the one just before this, on the 22nd of April this year. But because of his failing health, he could not take part. So we've decided today that we'll remember him, each of us in our own way, and his contribution. Dan's indomitable courage and impeccable integrity drove him to leak the Pentagon Papers. Papers which revealed critical aspects of the Vietnam War and what the US and its allies were doing in Vietnam. Having distinguished himself as a whistleblower, Dan spent the rest of his life speaking truth to power. For him, the focus was nuclear weapons and war. In his own words, and this is quoted in an article, one of the many tributes to Dan, this article by John Deere. Dan Ellsberg had said, "As I look back on the last 60 years of my life, I think there was no greater cause to which I could have dedicated my efforts," referring to the fight against war and nuclear weapons. 60 years of his life. And this webinar is an attempt to honor the man and his great achievements. While we cherish Dan's remarkable legacy, let us also resolve, sisters and brothers, to ensure that justice is done to other whistleblowers in our time. And one of them is languishing in a prison cell in Britain, is Julian Assange, Australian citizen, charged with publishing vital information about US operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. We know that what he did was to tell the truth, to provide the right information which is the responsibility of a responsible journalist. And he is being punished. He's already spent many years in prison. And in the Ecuadorian embassy and in other places. Now, if the US government succeeds in extraditing him to the United States, which may happen any day now, we don't know. If they succeed, and if he is convicted, Julian Assange could spend 175 years in prison. That's the sentence, 175 years in prison. Why? Because he chose to tell the truth. We've all been campaigning for him. All of us here, I think, have signed petitions, taken part in protests on behalf of this brave journalist, this brave human being. I hope those of us who are attending this webinar will join in the chorus of protests. We have to strengthen our voices. We have to ensure that we succeed. In the case of this whistleblower, in preventing him from being extradited and from being jailed for the rest of his life. And we can, and we must succeed. And that would be our tribute to the late Dan Ellsberg. Our campaign, our efforts on behalf of people like him and others in the future. Now, before we begin our panel discussion, I would like to invite all of us here attending this webinar to remember Dan Ellsberg by observing a minute's silence as a tribute to the man and his stupendous achievements. The minute begins now. Thank you very much, dear sisters and brothers. May God bless you. And now I'd like to hand over the microphone to my dear friend and colleague, Joe Camilleri, to conduct this webinar. Joe, the mic is yours.
Unmute, please, Joe.
You're muted.
I hope everyone can now hear me. Apologies, I was muted for a few seconds. I was saying it's now my great pleasure to invite our first guest who will speak to us on this very important subject, which is of concern to everyone in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Victor Gao, who is Vice President of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization and Chair Professor of Suzhou University. He's had extensive experience in government, diplomacy, securities regulation, legal affairs, investment banking, private equity, and corporate management. Quite a list. He was Deng Xiaoping's English interpreter and has worked with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the UN Secretariat, and the Security and Futures Commission of Hong Kong, among other things. Professor Victor Gao happens to be right now in Vienna. The starting time of the webinar was 4 a.m. in the morning for him. We are doubly grateful to you. The floor is yours, Victor Gao.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings from Vienna, Austria. I'm very honored to attend today's very important seminar. I think the world today is really at a crossroad for peace versus confrontation and war, for cooperation versus rivalry, and eventually maybe a major threat to the survival of mankind. I think in this context, I would like to reciprocate the major sentiments expressed by the previous speaker, and I agree with all the points he just now mentioned, and allow me to make some personal observations. First, I think AUKUS is in violation of the Nuclear Treaty of Non-Proliferation. And if it is implemented, AUKUS will really deprive the Australian people of the rare privilege of living in a nuclear-free bubble. Now, in the world of today, nothing is more precious and more valuable than the ability of living in a nuclear-free bubble. And I hope people in Australia will realize that and will take actions against the steps taken by the Australian government, the current one as well as the previous one, in conjunction with the US government and the UK government. Why? Because, first of all, based on my personal memories of what I did in the 1980s, I traveled to Australia with 3 important government delegations from China. I also participated in welcoming the former Prime Minister Bob Hawke from Australia visiting China. At that time, Australia always took great pride in being a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone. And it took a lot of efforts to maintain that status. And I would say the AUKUS arrangement, even though they claim that the arrangement would result in a nuclear-powered submarine, I would say this is really splitting the hair. Why? Because in the heat of a battle, no one will pause and stop and verify what will be the warhead to be launched from the tubes in that submarine. And the nuclear-powered submarine in itself, in the heat of a battle, may become a nuclear device to be exploded if it is attacked or if it is attacking someone else. Therefore, and in addition to the fact that a huge amount of highly enriched nuclear materials will be transferred to Australia, enabling it to leapfrog to the forefront of nuclear technologies, having a nuclear submarine, whether it is nuclear powered or eventually in the heat of battle, it will really be able to launch nuclear warheads, for example. It will add to the insecurity of our region rather than reducing the security concerns in the Asia-Pacific region. Therefore, I personally oppose to AUKUS, and I hope all of us will oppose to this AUKUS arrangement. And I hope Australia will continue to remain a member of the nuclear-free treaty, as well as a proud member of the South Pacific nuclear-free zone. This is very important for other reasons, but more importantly for the fundamental interest of the people in Australia, because I hope they will continue to enjoy this bubble of nuclear-free arrangement, so that they will not be targeted with nuclear warheads in times of war or in times of peace. That's number one. Number two is that we hear a lot of talk about this Indo-Pacific. Allow me to emphasize one point. I think the reference to Indo-Pacific is neither Indo nor Pacific. First of all, as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, it only includes India rather than all the other countries on the rim of the Indian Ocean. For example, countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh, countries in the eastern part of Africa, you name it, they are not included in the Indo-Pacific framework. Now, even worse, many Pacific Rim countries are not included, especially in Central America and South America. Countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile, they are not included. But even more profoundly disturbing is that China is not included. In a sense, the reference to Indo-Pacific is not for partnership or cooperation or equal treatment of all the countries either along the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. It is a strategic design and scheme to exclude China. Now, how can anyone really indulge in the fantasy that they can actually dictate which countries to be included, which countries to be excluded when you use a geographical term like Indo-Pacific? And therefore, I not only personally opposed to such references like Indo-Pacific, I also would call on everyone involved to expose the real evil designs in phrases like Indo-Pacific. And I hope we will be very realistic and pragmatic when we talk about great geographical terms like Indo or Pacific. And for the moment, I would urge that we continue to use the term Asia Pacific or APEC for the purpose of being inclusive, aimed at cooperation and partnership and joint efforts to overcome problems and challenges either in development terms or in climate change efforts, etc. Now, allow me also to expose one fallacy which I've detected. You know, there was a book called Destined for War, implying Thucydides' trap between China and the United States, implying that these two countries eventually are destined for war. Now, why do I consider this as applied to China and the United States is a fallacy rather than a truth? Because the author analyzed dozens of cases of war for the past 2,000 years or so and came up with his conclusion. But he didn't bother to tell you that all the cases of war he analyzed were conventional wars. And he had the audacity to apply the conclusion he reached by analyzing conventional wars to China and the United States, which are both nuclear powers. And I hope you will agree with me that the fallacy of this analysis is not only flawed, but is also deeply disturbing, because it has fooled and misguided lots of people in the United States to believe that between China and the United States, they are destined for war. allow me to emphasize, war is not and should not be an option between China and the United States, because both armed to the teeth with not only conventional war, or conventional weapons, but also nuclear weapons, a war between China and the United States will really speedily get out of control and escalate beyond the point of no return and eventually becoming Armageddon, not only for the Chinese people, but also for the American people, but more importantly, for mankind as a whole. Therefore, we need to really call on everyone involved, not only in China and in the United States, but throughout the world, not to agitate for war between China and the United States. And in this context, I've come up with my term called inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Why? Because I do hope decision makers both in Washington and in Beijing will realize that war should not be pursued between China and the United States. And eventually, whether they like each other or not, they should engage in peace in dealing with each other and try to get along with each other despite of their differences. And their differences should actually strengthen them rather than divide them and eventually push them into the abyss of war. Therefore, please also consider my appeal that we need to expose the fallacy of destined for war as if it is a fallacy between China and the United States. And I hope you will pick up my call for the inevitability of peace. Now, inevitability of peace between China and the United States should be firmly based on the mutually assured destruction, because if any side believes that it may gain a strategic head start against the other side, it may actually become a temptation to resort to war rather than try to live and let live between China and the United States. Therefore, please share with me my theory about the inevitability of peace between China and the United States, and I hope that will be the megatrend of our time. Allow me also to analyze with you why I think the United States is now agitating for war between China and the United States. I think the United States is confusing itself by combining two nightmares into one lethal nightmare. On the one hand, Washington worries that China will surpass the United States as an economy, and it wants to do whatever it can to deny China's continued economic development. Now, the second nightmare the United States is suffering is that it believes that once China surpasses that of the United States as an economy, China may impose its political system, ideology, ways of doing things, values, etc., onto the United States. Now, from the Chinese perspective, we think these two nightmares should not be combined together into one lethal nightmare, and these two nightmares actually are false to start with. On the one hand, China believes the continued economic growth and development of China is a megatrend of our time. And we believe in less than 10 years, the size of the Chinese economy will surpass that of the United States if we use official exchange rate as the benchmark. If we use purchasing power parity, the size of the Chinese economy is already significantly larger than that of the United States. Now, on the other hand, China does believe that whether in the past, at present, or in the future, China will not impose its political system, ideology, ways of doing things, or values onto the United States or onto any other country, because China wants to promote peaceful coexistence, and China wants to treat every country, big or small, as an equal. Now, in this particular respect, also allow me to emphasize another point. That is, the United States is really very much driven by doing whatever it can to maintain its hegemony. And that hegemony is very much based on a unipolar world. However, in the world of today, I don't think there are really countries who want to live in subjugation to any single country. I think multipolarity is already a fact, and it should not be denied, it should not be ignored, and I hope decision makers in the United States will come to terms with the fact that the world of today is a world of multipolarity. We used to call it multilateralism. Now I think increasingly more and more people are calling the world of today as a multipolar world. This is a fact rather than a fantasy. This is a reality rather than an academic pursuit. Now, the other point I want to say is that I always try to figure out what will be the best term to describe what the United States has been doing against China in terms of maximum hostility and confrontation and rivalry against China. Sometimes the US decision makers call it cooperation to some extent, competition to other extent, and confrontation to the extent necessary. I think they confuse these concepts. They do not want to compete with China. And I don't think China wants to compete with the United States. The economic development in China has its own logic and momentum. And no one can stop China's economic development. I would even go further to say that any country which wants to deprive the Chinese people of their right of economic development will be guilty of the largest crime against humanity in human history. No one should even think about or dare to engage in such heinous crimes against humanity by denying 1.4 billion people of their right of economic development. Therefore, it is time to urge decision makers in Washington to come to terms with the fact that China is here, China will remain here, and China and the United States need to deal with each other on equal terms, promoting peace rather than agitating for war or confrontation. Therefore, the term I've come up with is Tonya Harding syndrome. You know Tonya Harding, who used to be a national figure skater champion, and out of her twisted mind, together with her husband, they wanted to bludgeon the kneecap of Nancy Kerrigan, a competitor, out of commission. Eventually, things were discovered, and Tonya Harding was banned from figure skating competition for life. Now, I think what the United States is doing, not only in imposing tariffs against Chinese export to the United States, technological wars, talents wars, you name it, as well as hostility leading towards confrontation, they are more or less all driven by this Tonya Harding syndrome, because they do not want to live and let live with China. They do not want to engage in fair competition if it has to be. It wants to manhandle China and deny China's access to economic development. And the very dangerous war called Chips War is part of this hostility against China. Allow me to present my personal analysis of this Chips War.
Professor Gao, 1 more minute.
Thank you. Thank you. I will wrap up very quickly. China is the biggest customer of the semiconductor chips produced not only in the United States, but Japan, Republic of Korea, and China's Taiwan province. You always need to take good care of your biggest customer. If you want to take political actions which will eventually prevent your companies from selling to your biggest customer, you will eventually lead to economic suicide of the semiconductor businesses in your own country and in your countries like the Netherlands or Japan or Republic of Korea or China's Taiwan province. Therefore, I think eventually the end result of this chips war launch by the United States is to encourage China to go independent and self-reliant in semiconductor chips. And I would dare to say that in less than 10 years, China will not need to import any chips from the United States. And that will be the time of major difficulty for the semiconductor producers in the United States. Let's hope for the best, and let's encourage the inevitability of peace between China and the United States, and let's join our efforts to oppose war of all kinds and confrontation and rivalry among nations. And let's hope that the world of tomorrow will be a world of peace, coexistence, and prosperity for mankind as a whole. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Victor Gao, for your insightful and forceful comments, which I'm sure have been very carefully and widely listened to, and we'll have opportunities to go into some of these issues you've raised a little more during the Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Now let me, if I may, turn our attention to our second guest for today, and that is Dr. Alison Broinowski, who has had a very significant contribution made over a number of years, both in her role formerly as a diplomat and more recently in her engagement with issues of war and peace across the board. And in Australia's case, she was until recently president of an important group which is concerned with limiting the war powers currently exercised by the executive and ultimately by the Prime Minister. She's also a member of the board World Beyond War. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, and the floor is yours, Alison. Alison, you are muted.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for including me in such distinguished company. I'm very pleased to be here and to meet all of you. I'm speaking from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, that is, in Sydney. And I congratulate you too on calling your series Shape, because what you're trying to do, and I think what we're all trying to do, is shape our future, shape it in a different way from the way it has been before. And this ought not to be beyond our capacity. Nevertheless, I'd like to suggest today that in this century, in the few years, the 2 decades that this century has elapsed, the world has wasted a lot of time being paralyzed by fear. Ever since the 11th of September in 2001, the so-called war on terror has changed the lives of most people for the worse. Millions have been killed either by terrorists or by militarists fighting against them. Fearing violence, many people have fled their homelands as refugees. Others have absorbed repeated warnings about Islamist terrorism and fearfully accepted that the response to that has to be more militarism. In Australia, fear of terrorism made many of us hostile to Muslims and suspicious of our neighbours in ways that had not been known for decades. But Australia's enthusiasm for our Asian region had already begun to wither from 1996, when John Howard, as Prime Minister, said, we didn't have to change who we are to be accepted in Asia, and disparaged the whole concept of multiculturalism in Australia. The recommendations contained in Ken Henry's report, Australia in the Asian Century, which appeared in 2012, about making us all Asia literate, as he put it, were immediately buried by the coalition government in 2013. In this century, Australia has passed 90 pieces of anti-terror legislation that restrict our civil liberties and allow authorities to surveil what we read, write, ask, and why. And this makes many people more afraid, more accepting of this kind of authority over our lives. As fear of terrorism gradually faded, our leaders found new sources of terrorism to frighten us with, like threats from cyber, pyro, drone, biological, nuclear, space, and artificial intelligence technologies. Thereby, and I believe this to have been their motive, keeping people scared and compliant. And that meant, in turn, that money would continue to flood the military-industrial surveillance complex and enable endless wars. Our leaders found new national enemies too. When many Australians were becoming less afraid of terrorism and Islamic State, suddenly we were warned about agents of foreign influence in our midst. In mid-2018, Prime Minister Morrison gave a positive speech about China one week, and the very next, a hostile one. About, you can imagine where the instructions to do that came from. About half of Australians have now, since then, been talked into hating Russia and fearing China, neither of which poses a threat to Australia, as previous speakers have said. As with the war on terror, the new anti-China agenda was generated for Australia by Americans who saw Beijing's rising influence, as has been said, as a threat to the US global hegemony. It was delivered faithfully by allied governments and their compliant media. And as always, the response to it had to be more sanctions, more fighting, more militarism. The only way we have been conditioned to know how to respond to threats. But have we been, this is what I want to ask, been made to fear the wrong wolf? If there's a wolf at our door, is it terrorism or militarism or neither? Is it China or is it America? Or is it our own government? Certainly, the United States wants to contain China, and so Australia has loyally joined them in the South China Sea, in the Quad, and in AUKUS, with the same intention. In 2020, Australian ministers echoed them in quite gratuitously, provoking China over the COVID-19 outbreak. We now allow unfettered access for American troops, ships, and aircraft to Australian territory. They are able to launch attacks from here whenever and against whomever they wish, thereby potentially making Australia a target. Yet our ministers keep talking about sovereignty as if we have any left. Because we're fearful, Australians continue to trust the United States implicitly. And our governments do whatever any US administration wants. Never mind that British allies let us down in World War II, and our American ones can equally be expected to do the same and serve their own interests before ours in a subsequent war. The US can always retreat from East Asia. Australia cannot. The Australian Defence Force is, quote, interchangeable, we now say, with the US military. And our mainstream media bang on about the coming war against China, almost welcoming it, with no discussion of who will win it or what the consequences will be. We go on, as always, offering more inducements to keep Americans engaged in our region, AUKUS being just the latest, the biggest, and the most irrational. Our Foreign Minister Penny Wong is fond of saying that we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be. But as Jeffrey Sachs, acknowledgement here, has recently observed, 95.9% of the world's people don't want to be the 4.1% who are Americans, or to have them run the world for them. New blocks of nations are forming across the world and expanding in the global East and South. And they want to do things differently. They're building impressive infrastructure and trade networks, particularly with Chinese support. They're moving away from the US dollar as a reserve currency and getting around US sanctions by conducting business between themselves in rubles or renminbi or whatever. They're challenging the world by lawful and peaceful means, not by waging war. And as American hegemony withers, as it will, non-alignment is dawning again after several decades in relative eclipse. The idea that nations should cooperate without threat or use of force, a fundamental premise that of the UN Charter, is now guiding many countries led by China, and some of them are opting for armed or unarmed neutrality. Yet the US keeps on talking up its own international rules-based order, loyally echoed in this by Australia, while China and its Eurasian and Southern friends continue to advocate the non-aggressive international law-based order. Australia is resisting this global trend, clinging irrationally and fearfully to past assurances and failing to change with the times. The world has moved on, Penny Wong often tells us, but she and her fellow leaders are not taking Australia with it, not on climate change, not on nuclear weapons, nor on non-alignment. I just add to what has been said earlier that Australia refuses to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Australians devised. So our government and its predecessor are out of touch with what many Australians want. In Melbourne, the Council for the Human Future just last year listed 10 existential threats to Australia and the world. Its report is called Surviving and Thriving in the 21st Century, and I recommend it. It called for a radical change in the way we think to shift humanity from confrontation to collaboration. It stated, there are other ways to solve these threats than through political, military, or economic conquest. So my question is, before it's too late, can Australians stop being too scared to do this? I'll leave the question open for discussion. Thank you.
Joe, you're on mute.
My apologies again. I was thanking Alison for her very important contribution, the many issues she raised, and importantly, the compelling question she finished with that we might be able to address a little more as we go through the rest of the program. Well, if I may now, I want to just, before we go on to the next speaker, just draw your attention to a couple of things to do with SHAPE, because much of the future of what SHAPE does depends on others coming in and playing their role. So if Ben would be kind enough to share the screen and show us the website that SHAPE has now put together, and I think it's coming up shortly.
It has come. And stop.
There it is. Now, what I want to draw to your attention is that in addition to events, both forthcoming and past, SHAPE is making a point of producing and posting a number of opinion pieces on a wide range of issues, a few of which are listed on the homepage and many more on the particular page, which is the blog page. And in addition to that, we hope to include a number of very important resources, not just our own, but other organizations. We are happy to be sponsored on this occasion for this webinar by several other organizations, including the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, Pax Christi, the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, and several others that I'll mention a little later. And we ourselves are more than happy to sponsor other organizations in their particular projects and activities, if they more or less align with what we're trying to do. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we have just established an international council of about 17 or 18 people, many of whom, in fact, signed the initial call that I will mention in a moment, and their names, the International Council, the membership of the Council, will soon be uploaded on the website as well. So there's much to see on the website, initial stages, but we have significant plans for its further development in the next few months and beyond. So please have a look and introduce others to the website. The other thing I wanted to mention very briefly is the call we issued as one of our first, if not in fact the first initiative of SHAPE, which was a call to all who care about humanities and the planet's future. And if I may, I would like to take you to the website where that call appears, which is change.org. And you will see there that just under 4,000, around about 4,700 people have already endorsed it. And we're very keen in the next few weeks to reach the 5,000 mark. This is an overarching statement about how we see the future, the problems on the horizon, and possible ways of responding in the short and longer term. So if you have not looked at it, and certainly if you have not endorsed it as yet, please do so in the next few days or week or so. And if you think it more or less aligns with your thinking, please do endorse it and encourage others to do likewise. Well, now I would like to move on to our next speaker, and that is someone I've known for some time, but have not, in fact, been in touch with him in recent times. So it's a great pleasure to have him with us today. Professor Chung-in, who is Distinguished University Professor of Yonsei University, He has served as the special advisor to President Moon Jae-in of South Korea for unification, foreign affairs, and national security. He was also at a certain time an ambassador for international security for South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He attended the first Korean summit in 2001 and the next one in 2007 as a special delegate. He's co-convener of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament and editor-in-chief of Global Asia. Professor Chung-in, we would love you to address us.
Thank you, Joe. 30 years has elapsed since I met you in Melbourne, and it is nice to see you doing this wonderful work. And today's topic is about the Asia-Pacific NATO. About 2 weeks ago, I had a chance to visit Berlin and to meet the political leaders, opinion leaders, and etc. And Asia-Pacific NATO, or extension of NATO into Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, has been very, very popular topic there. But I was somewhat puzzled by by the way they raised the issue, because of course I agree with them. Taiwan crisis, South China Sea issue, or Korean Peninsula issues, they are all urgent issues. But I personally believe that they are not on the stage of leading to the major conflict escalation. And what is needed at this point is a crisis, how to ensure crisis stability, and how to come up with a preventive diplomacy to ensure crisis stability. But all our friends in Europe are talking about possible dispatch of NATO forces into that part of the world. That was really, mind-boggling, and that really reminded me of English philosopher Whitehead's term, the fallacy of concrete and the misplacedness. Really, I see major disjuncture between objective reality in our part of the world and their ideational construction of a threat there. Therefore, there is real concern for that one. Really, in that way, I really witnessed there is a potential for fanning the flame of war in Asia Pacific. Thus, what is happening in this part of the world are still manageable through diplomacy, and I don't really understand why they are resorting to the use of forces in dealing with those issues. Therefore, that is my first concern. Therefore, my first concern is the appropriateness of all entire concept of Asia Pacific NATO. Okay, and then that lead to my second concern. My second concern is the rationale behind Asia in the Pacific NATO. Okay, and there are very few the NATO allies here. The United States, the only country. If AUKUS becomes operationalized, United in Great Britain and Australia might become, so-called the potential members, the friends of NATO. But the very few countries in Asia Pacific would want the extension of NATO in our part of the world, and because that will remind them of the revival of old Cold War structure. You may go back to Cold War period, starting with NATO and CENTO, Central Treaty Organization, CITO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, ANZUS, and bilateral alliance between US, Japan, US, ROK, and US, Taiwan at a time. There is a containment of the communist bloc, particularly Soviet Union. That kinds of old Cold War structure will be resurfacing in our part of the world. And more than that, we are not really, I think that NATO's expansion is not justified. NATO is about North Atlantic, and why Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific? And I think the NATO countries need to come up with a full, theoretical justification for the extension. Okay, therefore, the only way we can understand is what the NATO is expanding into Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific in order to assure American primacy in the region, as well as antagonism against China. I think that will not be acceptable to the people and countries in the region. And third, issue which I'm concerned is the whole debate on the collective defense versus collective security, ideas. If you go back to United Nations Charter, it is based on the collective security. Collective security assumes a security community in which no enemies or threats are presumed. All countries are members of security community. If one country invade other member of the security community, and all other form of collective defense and defend these invaded countries, there is basic concept of collective security embodied in UN charters. But now all this idea of collective security is putting aside, and there is a dominance of collective defense based on American alliance. And I think really we think about it. I think Professor Gao raised that issue very clearly. That China has become new target for threat, and all others should be united again under the American umbrella and to and encircle and contain China. Is that approach is appropriate to ensure lasting peace in this part of the world? Okay, would that kind of arrangement enhance the security and stability in the region? I'm quite doubtful about that one. Okay, therefore, and treating China, Russia, North Korea as enemies or potential enemies, is it good for us?
Not
And
watching him.
I'm
Well
quite
done.
doubtful about that kinds of conceptualization. If that is should be discussed in detail. And finally, I wanted to raise the issue of the receptibility of the extension of NATO in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Okay, and we still remember the specter of a colonial rule in our part of the world. Now, going back to Opium War in 19th century, okay, old British gunboat diplomacy, even Korea saying we opened our border, okay, as a result of gunboat diplomacy of the United States, France, and Great Britain in late 19th century. Okay, therefore, in other words, France or Germany sending France sending carrier battle group to our part of the world, or Germany sending frigate, Great Britain sending warships to our part of the world. Would that kind of act be justifiable? What would be reception of Asia Pacific countries regarding that kinds of military expansion of NATO? I would say that they will be quite critical of that kinds of approach. And also, again, Professor Gao talked about the idea of Indo-Pacific. And also, we got to remember the entire concept of Indo-Pacific, which Abe Shinzo, former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, popularized at his speech at the Indian Parliament in 2007. But as the concept of a meeting of two oceans, Indian and the Pacific, and derived from the Karl Haushofer, who was chief geopolitical strategist of Nazi Germany. Okay, he wrote the book called the Geopolitics of the Pacific in 2021, and I think that from that book, I understand the Prime Minister Abe developed the concept of meeting of two oceans. But according to that book, in fact, what Karl Haushofer was proposing was this: all this India-Pacific region is not being colonized by the Great Britain, France, United States, and in the Netherlands, and therefore Japan should work too hard to kick them out, and then Germany and Japan to form an alliance to dominate the world. Therefore, if you look at the geopolitical origin or intellectual origin of Indo-Pacific, it is in a very unacceptable, the discourse, from the beginning. And I really don't understand why those ideas are popping out. What I'm saying is this revival of geopolitical discourses, which was kind of taboo during the Cold War period, is a very bad omen for peace, stability, and security in our part of the world. Therefore, on the occasion of this new debate on Asia-Pacific NATO, we need to really discuss about the desirability of the revival of geopolitics, as well as the transition from Asia-Pacific concept to Indo-Pacific concept. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung-in Moon, for your contribution and for delving a little more deeply into both the origins of the Indo-Pacific concept and the way it is being applied and some of the implications. Well, now we come to our fourth contributor, our fourth guest, and it's a great privilege to introduce to you Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's also president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition. He is an academician at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Holy See. He is SDG, Social Development Goals Advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he previously served as Special Advisor to UN Secretary General and Ban Ki-moon. So it's great privilege and pleasure to have you with us. So Jeffrey Sachs, it's over to you. By the way, we're hearing some noises in the background. I don't know where they're coming from, but if they could be muted, that would be very helpful.
Good afternoon to everybody. And the noise may be coming from my area. It's 6 a.m. where I am in Athens. So I'm in a cafeteria, which is very nicely allowing me to have the video now. And I hope that I can be heard. I want to thank you for inviting me and thank SHAPE for its leadership. And I just had the privilege to listen to Alison, Broinowski, and Chung-in Moon. And these are brilliant statements that we've all been treated with. Absolutely insightful. I absolutely agree with all that has been said. The world has gone mad, but especially the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm afraid. I don't know whether there is any sense at all in our little English-speaking corner of the world. I'm, of course, speaking of the United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's something profoundly disheartening about the politics of our countries right now. The deep madness, I'm afraid, is British imperial thinking taken over by the United States. My country, the US, is unrecognizable now compared even to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, who runs the country. I do not believe it is the President of the United States right now. We are run by generals, by our security establishment. The public is privy to nothing. The lies that are told about foreign policy are daily and pervasive by a mainstream media that I can barely listen to or read anymore. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the main television outlets are 100% repeating government propaganda by the day. And it's almost impossible to break through. What is this about? Well, as you've heard, it's about a madness of the United States to keep U.S. hegemony, militarized, dominated by the thinking of generals who are mediocre intellects, personally greedy, and without any sense, because their only modus operandi is to make war. And then cheerled by Britain, which is unfortunately in my adult life increasingly pathetic in being a cheerleader for the United States for this hegemony and for war. Whatever the US says, Britain will say it 10 times more enthusiastically. And it could not love more the war in Ukraine, which is the great second Crimean War for the British media and for the British political leadership. Now, how Australia and New Zealand fall for this idiocy is really a deep question for you, because people should know better, but I'm afraid that it is the Five Eyes and the security establishment that tell the politicians, to the extent that the politicians are involved in this, well, this is how we have to do it. This is our security state. And I don't think our politicians necessarily have much role in this. By the way, the public has no role at all in US foreign policy, at all. We have no debate, no discussion, no deliberation, no debates over voting the 113 billion, but in fact much more money spent on the Ukraine war so far. There's not been an hour of organized debate, even in the Congress, on this, much less in the public. But my guess is that your security establishment is really the driver of this. And then they explain to the Prime Minister and to the others, you know, this is the utmost national security. And this is what America has told us, and let me explain what we're seeing. And of course, you cannot divulge this to the broader public, but this is at the essence of the struggle for survival in the world. Everything I see myself, I'm 43 years in this activity as an economic advisor all over the world, is nonsense. And one thing that would be interesting for people to look at to understand these developments is a very telling article by a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Robert Blackwell, and Ashley Tellis, written for the Council on Foreign Relations about 8 years ago now. I just want to read a couple excerpts from it, because it laid out the whole plan of what's happening right now pretty directly, which is how things work in the US, which is through the establishment media, you're basically told in not necessarily completely explicit terms what's going to happen, because what is unfolding right now is really part of a longer term planned agenda. It's not ad hoc. So here's what Blackwell and Tellis wrote in 2015. First, quote, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." And then argues that this goal of primacy ought to remain the central objective of US grand strategy in the 21st century. So what's the goal? The goal is very straightforward. It is primacy of the United States globally. Then Blackwell and Tellis lay out the game plan for China. So they tell us what to do. Here's the list. I'm only excerpting. Quote, "Create new preferential trading arrangements among US friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China." okay, this is the game that already Obama started with TPP. He couldn't get it through, but I'll go on and then I'll comment. Second, create a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, to build up, quote, power political capacities of US friends and allies on China's periphery, and strengthen US military forces along the Asian rimlands, despite any Chinese opposition. What I find remarkable about this is this was a list made in 2015. It's exactly the step-by-step plan of action. This is repeated in recent history. In 1997's Big Brzezinski, in an article in Foreign Affairs, laid out exactly the timeline for NATO enlargement and the intention to include Ukraine in NATO enlargement, because this was already the security establishment plan. Of course, it's led us directly to the Ukraine war, which is a war over NATO enlargement. Now the friends that have, and the geniuses that have brought the world the Ukraine war, want to bring the war to your neighborhood with as Professor Moon said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization starting to open its offices in Asia, which is not exactly the North Atlantic. So this is where we are. It's not absolutely simple to see through for one main reason. At least in the US, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I expect that it's the same. We have no honesty or discussion at all about this. The policies are owned entirely by the security establishment, the military-industrial complex, the network of, quote, think tanks, which are non-think tanks in Washington, every one of which is funded by the military-industrial complex. They've taken over the East Coast universities entirely, where I teach. I taught 20 years at Harvard. I teach at Columbia University. This is our milieu right now. And the silent coup happened in essence. No debate, no public politics, no honesty, no documents revealed, everything secret, everything confidential, and mysterious moves. And since I happen to be an economist that engages with heads of state around the world, I hear a lot of things. And so I've seen and heard a lot of things directly, which help me to understand the lies every day. But you will not find any of this in our public discourse. Just a word about the Ukraine war. Completely predictable and part of a plan of action that goes back to the early 1990s to essentially bring Ukraine into the US military orbit. And Brzezinski, again in 1997 in the Global Chessboard, his geopolitical book, laid it out completely. Russia without Ukraine is nothing. Ukraine is the geographical pivot for Eurasia, and basically go get it. Interestingly, Brzezinski said in 1997 in the book, but the one thing absolutely American policymakers need to ensure is that they don't push Russia and China into an alliance together. But then he says, that's pretty much unthinkable. You know, don't worry about that, but that would be the craziest thing in the world. And it's exactly what these crazy people have done. I happen to have been an advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin, and to Kuchma in the early days of both the late days of perestroika and the early days after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I watched very closely what was happening. I saw that the United States was absolutely uninterested in any way in helping Russia to stabilize. The idea from the start was unipolarity, keep Russia down, and take steps already decided in 1992, basically, in direct contradiction to what had been told to Gorbachev and Yeltsin to start expanding NATO. So this is a game plan with a long horizon. When it comes to China, and by the way, the US was deeply implicated in the overthrow of Ukraine's president in 2014. It was a coup. It was to an important extent a regime change operation of the United States, not entirely, but to a very significant extent. I happened to see part of it in a very weird way up close, and I know how US money poured into supporting the Maidan, and it was incredibly disgusting and very unnerving, and Putin noticed that the US contributed to the overthrow of a friendly government next door, in the context of the explicit intention to push NATO, by the way, not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia. And when one looks at the map, it's Brzezinski's idea: surround Russia in the Black Sea region. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all be members of NATO. That would be the end of Russian power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So go these geniuses. And Putin gave many opportunities for negotiation out of this. The Minsk agreements endorsed by the UN Security Council in 2021, December 17, he put on the table perfectly reasonable document for negotiation, the draft US-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO expansion. The US blew it off. I called the White House after that was put on the table, spoke to one of our top security officials, and said, negotiate. Stop the NATO enlargement. You have a chance to avoid war. The United States' formal response to Putin was, NATO is non-negotiable. This is something only between the US and Ukraine, and Russia has no say in NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It's a mind-boggling way to pursue foreign affairs because it is a direct road to war. As you know, I hope everybody understands, this war in Ukraine was close to ending in March 2022 with a negotiated agreement a month after Russia invaded on February 24th, with an agreement between Ukraine and Russia that the United States stopped because the US said, fight on, don't negotiate, don't accept neutrality. And so here we are in a war that continues to escalate towards possible nuclear war, which is what would happen if Russia were to suffer deep defeats on the battlefield. It's not doing that right now. It's not experiencing that. But if it did, it just escalates to nuclear war. Russia is not going to be defeated, pushed out of Crimea, and go home meekly and saying, we're sorry we did that. It's going to escalate if it needs to escalate. So we are right now in a spiral that is extremely dangerous. Japan plays utterly into this. And Australia, it's so sad to watch Australia in a accepting to be used in this reckless way, to pay a fortune to be used in this reckless and provocative way. And US actions, by and large, till now, with very few exceptions, US actions are putting us on a path to war with China in the same way that US actions did in Ukraine. Only this war, well, but either war could end everything. But the whole idea of the US and its allies fighting China is mind-boggling in its implications, in its stupidity, in its profound dangers, and in its utter divorce from real security interests and from reality, because China is not a threat to Australia. It is not a threat to the world. And last time I looked, correct me because there's some experts in the room, many more than I, but I don't know of a single overseas Chinese invasion in its history, by the way, other than on the borders. I don't know in its whole history, except when the Mongols briefly ruled China and tried to invade Japan. Other than the Mongol invasion, defeated by a typhoon, other than that, I don't know of another single case in 2,200 years of Chinese statecraft. So this is not exactly at the top of my worry list. This is what worries me about the world is a deeply neurotic United States that aims to be number one, that can't be number one in the way that it self-believes to be number one, that has a pathetic, and I'm sorry to use the term, but it is pathetic, cheerleader in London every day saying how wonderful it is. Empire is great. You should go try it. We love it.
Jeffrey,
yeah, I'm going to stop here. Sorry to go on and on, but let me just, if I could, 1 minute to say what should be done. The war in Ukraine could end the day after Biden steps up and says NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. Believe it. The basis for negotiation has been there for 20 years and rejected by the US. Second, the idea of opening NATO offices in Asia is mind-boggling in its risk and its stupidity. And please tell the Japanese, stop this. It's reckless. Third, the US approach to Taiwan, except in a glimmer of reality of Blinken last month, is profoundly dangerous, provocative, and deliberately so. Fourth, what is needed is regional dialogue in Asia, among Asians and among the Asia Pacific. And fifth, use RCEP, because RCEP is actually the correct concept for the region, to bring together China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand in a coherent framework, especially around the climate challenge, energy policy, trade policy, investment policy, would do a world of good, not only for the 15 in the Asia Pacific, but for the entire world. Sorry to have run on so long and to ramble, but it's so important what SHAPE is doing. You're completely on the right track, and all best wishes to your efforts.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for a very penetrating look at some of the disturbing developments that you discussed, and some ideas about where to from here. Well, now, we've come to the Q&A session. Of course, we are restricted by time. There are 20-odd questions, and there's no way we can do justice to them all. We should consider perhaps at some point putting some of these questions on the website and see whether they can invite some comments, including from our speakers today. But let's have a go at least dealing a few of these questions. I will try and put them into a basket of related questions and see what our speakers make of them. And if I may ask our four guests to keep this in mind, they don't have to answer each and every question that's posed. You may like to just pass the baton on to others for particular questions and reserve what you have to say for questions which are of closest interest to you. Okay. One set of questions has to do with AUKUS and the nuclear submarines. So let's deal with them as quickly as we can. One of them basically asks what is likely to be the reaction of the neighborhood, mainly primarily Southeast Asia and ASEAN itself. That's one question in relation to AUKUS. The other one is, what's so special about AUKUS and nuclear submarines? The great powers themselves have nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, which travel through the oceans. Will just a few extra submarines make much of a difference? Is this such a big deal? I'm encapsulating a number of questions around AUKUS submarines. Any comment from anyone? If so, unmute yourself. Anyone wants to comment on it?
This is Victor Gao. Allow me to make several quick points. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, among the three AUKUS members, the United States and United Kingdom are nuclear powers, each having its own nuclear submarines. However, for the two existing nuclear powers to transfer its nuclear technology and nuclear materials to Australia, which is up to today a nuclear-free power, to a region which traditionally, as far as I remember, ever since the 1980s, has prided itself for being a nuclear-free zone, is very dangerous. It means it is taking away this veil of nuclear-free zone from not only Australia itself, but from the South Pacific region. And it may also cause nuclear arms race, because you asked about the response of other countries. I understand both Indonesia and Malaysia are against that AUKUS idea, because they do not want to see that other countries in this particular neighborhood possess nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines in particular, because they believe this is a major cause of instability in this part of the world. Now, if you can transfer nuclear technologies as envisioned by AUKUS, what about other countries doing the same? Also transferring such nuclear technologies to other countries. Now, another point, allow me to emphasize. China is raising objections to AUKUS through IAEA. The point I want to make is that if AUKUS eventually will be approved by IAEA, then the AUKUS model may become a very bad precedent. Why? Because other nuclear powers can transfer such technologies to other countries. Therefore, this is a typical example of doing things as if there will be no consequences. Because eventually, if AUKUS becomes a precedent for other nuclear powers to transfer their technologies to other non-nuclear powers, it will be making the whole world much more dangerous. Thank you.
Unmute, please, Joe.
I'm not a very good moderator when it comes to remembering to unmute oneself. I was saying there are quite a few questions about the danger posed by nuclear weapons and what, if anything, can be done about it. And why is it that in so many countries, or that's at least what the question implies, one of the questions implies, there is so little said about the dangers posed by nuclear war or by nuclear threats and counter threats. Does anyone wish to say something about the nuclear weapons issue and the threat of nuclear war and how we are handling it or not handling it internationally?
Maybe I would say a quick word, if I might, Joe.
Yes.
Jeff Sachs here. I think one thing people should keep their eye on is the doomsday clock kept by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has been pushed to 90 seconds to midnight, which I regard as an accurate representation of how close we are to nuclear Armageddon. The clock is the closest that it has ever been since the start of the doomsday clock in 1947. We are absolutely pushing towards nuclear war in Ukraine. Russia, of course, has 1,700 deployed nuclear weapons, or 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, and thousands more tactical nuclear weapons. That's the strategic count. The US, the same. We are told daily by these geniuses in the Pentagon and in the military-industrial complex, don't worry about it, don't be blackmailed about nuclear risks. It's unbelievable to be told that, because anybody that knows the history of the nuclear age knows how close we have come to nuclear war on several occasions, and how many generals in the United States have urged nuclear attack. One of the reasons for the absolutely ardent, to the point of war, opposition of Russia to NATO enlargement is the prospect of missiles minutes away from Russian territory. Part of this risk goes back to 2002, when the United States unilaterally abandoned the ABM treaty. This was a devastating blow to the nuclear framework and to peace. And it was one of the key steps on the way to war in Ukraine, because not only did the US abandon the ABM treaty, but it positioned Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Russia made the very good point, we don't know what you're putting down those missile silos, but they can reach us in minutes. And this has been one of the top points emphasized by Russia all along. Then the United States, of course, under Trump, abandoned the INF treaty and has embarked on a multi-trillion-dollar upgrade, so-called, of our nuclear arsenal. So the US plays with this, and it tells us, don't be worried. It's terrifying, and of course be worried. Once in 2022, in the fall, Biden blurted out, or he didn't blurt out, he was caught on camera in a fundraiser in California that we're on a path to nuclear Armageddon. And you know what the response of the media was the next day? To chastise the president for saying this. He was attacked. How dare a president worry the American people this way? Well, that was the last we heard of it. His political advisors in the White House, no doubt, lectured our president, don't ever worry the American people this way again. So if you're not worried, you should be terrified.
Okay.
And let me add one more point as an
Yes.
extension of Professor Sachs in a point. Really, United Nations, General Assembly adopted abolition of nuclear weapons treaty. Who opposed it? United States opposed it, Japan opposed it, South Korea opposed it, Australia opposed it, and American allies and partners in Europe opposed it. Another example, okay, Russia, China, India, all countries have been adopting, China have been adopting no first use, nuclear doctrine. Who hasn't adopted no first use nuclear doctrine? United States and American allies. President Obama wanted to declare no first use doctrine. American allies opposed it. Therefore, and as Professor Sachs pointed out, who is the driving nuclear arms race? Trump studied the massive nuclear weapons modernization program. Therefore, our great ally, the United States, has become source of entire chaotic order in the nuclear, non-proliferation regime. Therefore, I think really civil society should come out and begin to raise that issue. Okay, there is a kind of mutually reinforcing mechanism between the U.S. and its allies and partners, not to suppress the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Okay. May I now turn to a third set of questions? And that relates to unipolarity, multipolarity, even bipolarity. One of the questioners says, do we have a multipolar world, or is it just a bipolar world, US and China? So any reflections on that? And two related questions, rather than worrying about unipolarity, multipolarity, should we be thinking more again about the potential of non-alignment, in which countries regard themselves not as part of a pole of any kind? And related to all this, unipolarity, multipolarity, bipolarity, whatever, where does that leave the United Nations? Any takers for those kinds of questions? Alison, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to your questioners about that. It sounds theoretical and like IR speak, and we shouldn't be wasting our time on it. But in fact, it's not a waste of time, as I think I was arguing before. The main contest in the world is between the countries who don't want there to be one global hegemon, that is to say, a unipolar world, and the very small, relatively small population of the world that lives in the United States and wants that, as its faithful allies seem to also do. And as you mentioned, and I was trying to point out too, in recent times, because of the shift of global gravity to the east, economic as well, we are seeing countries taking their future into their own hands in ways that hasn't been seen since the start of the non-aligned movement. And that's something that I think is particularly important for countries like Australia to be aware of and to be thinking about. And numerous civil society organizations in this country are, not our governments, not of either political persuasion at all. And that is because they are locked into the US alliance. They cannot front their own party, nor the electors, saying we have to put distance between ourselves and that. We have to even think about the advantages to us of non-alignment, or even armed neutrality, which might suit some people better. But I am convinced that unless we do that, and unless we have that kind of possibility raised with us, we raise it with our governments, we are, as my sister-in-law rudely says, she doesn't use this word, she says, we're doomed. Well, she uses an unpublishable word. That's Helen Caldicott.
Can I add one point? All this idea of a power configuration is depending upon, which country sees the world. The United States wanted to maintain unipolar moment. China wanted to see the world in terms of bipolarity, or G2, okay? And all other powers wanted to see the world in terms of multipolarity, or concept of power, just after 1815 Paris in a peace treaty or Vienna Congress. Okay, but great number of countries in the world wanted to see decentralized world, which is based on multilateralism. They wanted to recall the power of United Nations. Therefore, these are really competing visions on the configuration of a power in the world. But for me, I think most ideal is, I think let us recognize some kind of G2 arrangement between the US and China, but they should not monopolize power. They should be, restrained or constrained by the middle power, other middle powers, but in the direction of a multilateral order. And it is very important for us to resuscitate the power of United Nations, and also power and function of multilateral arrangements such as World Trade Organizations. I think that is the way we should go.
If I could add a word also, there were two unipolar moments in the world after World War II. The first was immediately after World War II, when the United States stood almost alone, untouched, or nearly untouched by physical war, and with a booming and technologically leading, even dominant industrial sector, and as the sole holder of atomic weapons, very briefly. And the US created many institutions at the time that were partly multilateral and partly US led and based, like the Bretton Woods institutions. The second unipolar moment was at the end of 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. China was still a very, very poor country. The Soviet Union lay in ruins, and the United States neoconservatives, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, in the final year of the Bush senior administration, created the concept of how the US would preserve its unipolarity. But these were moments, as Professor Moon just said, because today the economic reality is we're already in a multipolar world. The BRICS countries are a larger share of the world economy than the G7, if measured at international prices, that is purchasing power, parity adjusted GDP. This is momentous. We will not have a bipolar world because there are other poles of the world. India is behind China in its catching up process by 15 years perhaps, or 20 years, but it's now advancing strongly. It's even more populous than China, and will become much more populous than China as China's population peaks, ages, and India's continues to grow for several decades more. Africa will be a pole of the world society in the coming decades, because the African countries are figuring out that the imperial powers left them as 55 divided small nations, but they are unifying in the African Union. The list goes on. I think the kind of world practically that will evolve should evolve, is a UN charter-based world with suitable reforms, strong regional groupings like RCEP that end Cold War outdated divisions, and a lot of international relations among major regions, Europe, Russia and Central Asia, RCEP, South Asia, African Union, a UNISUR group of South America, and so forth. So multilateralism and regionalism on an economic basis, because creating a zero carbon energy system, bringing Australia's sunshine by submarine cable to ASEAN, integrating in the Asia-Pacific region on a new green infrastructure and industry is a regional scale effort. So this world already exists, except at the Council of Foreign Relations and in the minds of the US security establishment. We're already past the unipolar moment. It's just that the United States doesn't know it and doesn't accept it.
Okay, last time is getting away from us, so I hope some of the questioners will excuse us, but there's one set of questions that says, okay, US policies, the militarism, the hegemonic inclinations of that particular state, we understand, and the criticism is legitimate. But aren't some of China's actions also cause for criticism? For example, the refusal to abide by the International Arbitration Court's decision regarding sovereignty in the South China Sea, the dispute between the Philippines and China, and some other actions. Is there not something that China could and should be doing that it isn't doing, which could lead us to in more peaceful directions? So the bone pointed specifically at what China is doing or not doing that it could be doing. Any takers? Alison.
Okay. Just on that question about the South China Sea, if the United States wants other countries to abide by various decisions of various organizations and the findings of various panels in the UN, then it would be a very good idea if the United States ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. And until it does, it doesn't really have standing in this argument.
Anybody else? Professor Victor Gao, do you want to say anything on this? He may not be with us. So, anyone else?
I'm here. Victor Gao is here. Yes. Allow me to make several very brief points.
Yes.
Now, the United States.
You, by the way, that's your preference?
Yes, that's my preference for the moment. Yes.
That's okay, no problem.
Yes, the United States and its allies are really seizing upon the South China Sea issue. But allow me to mention very briefly, up to the unconditional Japanese surrender in August 1945, Japan was actually sitting on all the islands, atolls, and reefs in the South China Sea. And as part of the unconditional surrender terms, Japan surrendered all the islands, atolls, and the reefs in the South China Sea to China, aided by the US Navy, actually. And Japan was also occupying the Philippines in the Second World War. And in achieving victory, the United States military took back every piece of land which originally belonged to the Philippines in 1945, meaning whatever the United States did not take back from the Japanese military in 1945, as far as the Philippines was concerned, was not considered part of the Filipino territory. Therefore, if we do not go further into history, but just to the 1945, then the border issues or the sovereignty issues or the control issues of the islands and atolls and reefs in the South China Sea should be very well defined. Now, further, before the United States had some association with the Philippines, Philippines was controlled by the Spanish Empire. And when the Spanish Empire surrendered the Philippines to the United States at the end of the 19th century, there was a treaty between Spain and the United States, delineating very clearly the boundary of the Philippine Islands. Therefore, I think the United States is really confusing the world by claiming that there should be territorial disputes between China and several other nations. Allow me to emphasize, in 1945, there were no independent and sovereign Vietnam. Vietnam at that time was a French colony. There was no independent sovereign state of Malaysia or Indonesia. One was English, British colony. The other one was a Dutch colony, for example. And China at that time in 1945 was the only sovereign and independent country which did not surrender to Japan in the Second World War, which kept fighting all the way till the final victory. And we do not need to go further into history. We just need to go to 1945. That's one very important point. Now, secondly, I think China and all the other littoral countries in the South China Sea should really work together to achieve peace and stability. Now, the United States has been calling its activities innocent passage, for example, freedom of navigation. As far as China is concerned, no, it is not innocent passage. It's really loitering. The United States is loitering in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, through the Taiwan Strait, and pressing again and again, closer and closer to China's doorstep, in violation of territorial seas and spaces to some extent, and then really loitering along the Chinese coastline. This is the thing that's creating a lot of instability in our part of the world. And I hope all of us should see the realities on the ground and come to our own conclusions as to why there is increasing instability in our part of the world. It's not that China is really creating pressures on other countries. It's the United States creating more instability in our part of the world. And the Asia-Pacific region in general, the Southeast Asia or East Asia, for example, should remain free from such external pressure points created by the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we could have been here much longer answering other interesting and important questions, but unfortunately time for this occasion at least has defeated us. So I want to thank all the people who have asked questions, whether we had a chance to pose their questions or not. And thank you, of course, to the speakers for answering them in some cases as extensively as they could. So now it remains for me to invite the third convener of SHAPE, Professor Richard Falk, who I don't think needs any introduction to any of the people present. He's been one of those imposing figures, not just in the academic world, having written dozens and dozens of books, but in the world of public engagement on some of the most pressing issues of our time. He will just offer us a few concluding remarks before we wind up, and I mention a couple of things about where to from here. Okay, Richard, please.
Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks to these brilliant presentations that we've had the past 2 hours, and to the questions and answers that have followed them. I think what I derive as the most salient conclusion from the diverse presentations is this dangerous persistence of the United States to extend a unipolar reality in the face of multipolarity. Multipolarity is the reality. Unipolarity is the project dependent on military suppression of an accurate interpretation of the historic moment. And I think as Jeff Sachs so eloquently reminded us, the U.S. has succumbed to a kind of mindless militarism as a way of diverting attention from the fact that it is being outcompeted in peaceful activities, and especially by China, and sees itself as requiring a militarist set of responses to suppress this reality. And that tension between the militarist unipolar project and the multipolar imperatives of cooperation and stability and peace in a dangerously complex world is the crux of the historic situation that confronts us. And I think this webinar has very lucidly depicted the shape perspective as it applies to the Asia Pacific and to the distortions of security that are implicit in the extension of NATO and alliance by with non-Pacific country, at least non-Asian countries. This is a dysfunctional arrangement, and the other stress I think is important is the degree to which, since the war on terror, and since the defeat of American power in Vietnam, there has been a determined effort to depoliticize the American citizenry. And the media has played a central role in this process by becoming a vehicle of state propaganda managed by the Washington think tanks, the Pentagon, and the Council on Foreign Relations. The whole experience of the traumatizing experience of Vietnam, a war that was lost to what Lyndon Johnson called the 10th-rate Asian power, resulted in a number of fundamental adjustments, one of which was to try to avoid a new anti-war movement that was instrumental in bringing the war finally to an end. And that has led to this concerted effort to make the American public a non-actor in relation to the formation of foreign policy. This is disastrous because, again, as Jeff Sachs has so clearly pointed out, the military that seemed to be driving foreign policy in this period are very quick to have recourse to weaponry that can destroy the enemy, whatever the cost to the so-called victor or to our side. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, the military were advocating the use of nuclear power. Again, in Vietnam, they were advocating. Nothing is worse than accepting defeat. And that kind of mentality, which is predominant at this point, poses risks to not only the region, but to species survival. And it is in that spirit that we welcome this kind of regional focus where as the speakers have shown us, can easily eventuate in an apocalyptic war that would mean effectively the end of the world as we know it, and destroy the natural habitat as well as human civilization. So the message is very solemn, but the vision of an alternative is also part of the SHAPE worldview. There is a way of creating a stable, peaceful future, but it will require civil society activism of an unprecedented militancy. Governments are now the key governments that are pushing this kind of extension of post-Cold War unipolarity. They are not in a position where they can alter their postures unless they are under severe pressure. And that is really the challenge. How can civil society be mobilized in a short period of time to challenge this kind of militarist unipolarity that threatens to escalate nuclear dangers and cause a major war which is foreshadowed in Ukraine, but would culminate in the Asia-Pacific region with a war involving China. Let me stop there and thank all the participants, the audience, and the speakers for a strong dose of reality that we all need to swallow and take good preventive steps to avoid the disease.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. I want to, of course, extend the same thanks on behalf of SHAPE to everyone. Before doing so, I wanted to bring to your attention that SHAPE has a lot of ideas, initial plans for developing the conversation internationally, for bringing in a more focused way the contribution of a younger generation. This is something we're giving considerable attention to, and for thinking, as Richard foreshadowed, much more constructively and concretely about how we might see a reawakening of civil society, of the energies of civil society, calling into question some of the disturbing directions of government policies in different parts of the world. To do this, it can't be relied upon on the three conveners, each of whom is past the 70-year mark. We need to engage a lot more people. This is beginning to happen, and we need some resources. I want to make that very clear to those who are still with us. So it's an appeal to you to consider making some contribution, or inviting other people you know to make some contribution, not just to supporting activities, but also to contributing to the resources of this endeavor. Otherwise, it will disintegrate in the not too distant future, which is not what we would like to see. For this purpose, we have established a crowdfunding appeal with a modest target, And if you or those you know around you could make a contribution, and perhaps in a follow-up email, we will send you all the details as to how that can be done. Please treat it that, give it all your attention. And people often ask me if I'm to contribute, what is appropriate. Of course, one can't answer that. People's circumstances change, are different, one from the other. The way I answer it is contribute if you're supportive to the best of your ability till it hurts at least a little bit. So we take it from there. Let me now conclude by bringing this webinar to a close, thanking all those who have contributed, including Ben, who's been in charge of the technical aspects, Ben Freeman, for the conduct of this particular webinar, as he's done on previous occasions. Let me thank especially, of course, the speakers, Professor Victor Gao, who joined us at 4 o'clock in the morning in Vienna, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who joined us a little bit later, but not much later in Athens, and of course to Dr. Alison Broinowski and Professor Chung-in. We've greatly valued all your contributions, and let me thank all those who have attended, well over 300 out of 700 registrants. So obviously there were quite a few who could not make it, but probably registered in the expectation that they would get a recording of the event, which we will make available to all who registered, whether they attended or not, and hopefully to a number of others. So thank you to all of you. Would love to see your continued engagement with SHAPE and with the issues and the vision that SHAPE wants to bring to the table. Thank you. Travel safely wherever you are, and keep well.